The studio went silent as the clash erupted, a president's fury colliding with an unflinching voice of truth. Words that should have stayed hidden were dragged into the light, shaking the stage and the nation. When the veil lifted, the question burned: was this politics, or the unraveling of a marriage before millions? Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. The cameras swept across the glittering studio of America Unscripted, live. The crowd leaned forward in their seats, eager for banter, for the smooth rhythm of Hollywood anecdotes crossing with politics. The polished floor reflected the studio lights, every angle designed for spectacle. Host Karen Delaney smiled, her note cards fanned in her hand, as she tossed a seemingly harmless question to Samuel L. Jackson. It was meant to be light, playful, another crossover moment between celebrity and the political stage. But the moment Samuel smirked and then let his face still, the air inside the room seemed to harden. He spoke low, deliberate, surgical. "I don't do gossip. I do receipts. If you market a marriage as a the receipts matter." The audience gasped, the sound a sharp intake of disbelief. One tight shot caught a woman in the third row mouthing the words, "Oh my God." In the glass booth above the set, a producer's voice broke the silence. "Stay wide. Do not cut." The boom mic trembled above the studio floor. Every crew member sensed it. Something unscripted was happening. Something dangerous. Samuel's voice remained steady. "This isn't about private love. It's about public leverage, timelines, photo ops, and narrative sold as truth." Karen blinked rapidly, her cue cards shuffling in her hands. The graphics operator hovered over the red break button, but froze, unwilling to make the call. The audience didn't stir. Even the air conditioning hum felt louder, amplifying the weight of silence. Then came the sting. Samuel leaned forward, eyes locked on the camera. "When vows become props, policy gets a script doctor." A hard cut flashed to the split screen of Donald Trump, scheduled for a later response segment. He was already on camera, though not meant to be live. His head was bent, fingers moving furiously across his phone as he texted an aide. Samuel didn't break rhythm. "I won't name a private citizen. I will name the pattern. Curated appearances, off-book overlaps, and a brand that bills itself as virtue." The studio wall screens slammed to black before a new title seared across them. "Pilot Vows / Public Power," then dissolving into sharper words, "Who owns the story?" The stakes were set. Celebrity truth-telling versus political stagecraft. Privacy colliding with public trust. And already, far from the studio lights, Trump's spiral had begun. Samuel L. Jackson built a career on voice, presence, and timing. For decades, he read scripts and turned them into performances that shaped global culture. But what set him apart wasn't just the lines. It was the way he understood subtext. On screen, he could take a simple phrase and turn it into thunder. Off-screen, he began to notice the same kinds of scripts being run on the American public. Campaign slogans, media soundbites, and carefully staged family portraits were all lines in a performance meant to sway voters. Where others saw speeches, he saw storyboards. Where others saw authenticity, he saw costume design. From his early days on indie sets to starring in billion-dollar franchises, Samuel never forgot the neighborhoods that raised him. He fought for unions, stood up for voter rights, and constantly emphasized media literacy. "They sell you narratives," he would remind interviewers, "but you've got to ask, who's cashing the check?" His personal code was simple: don't punch down, don't lie, and don't let a camera gaslight a country. That code shaped his method. Samuel never trafficked in rumor. Rumor was flimsy, a weak prop that collapsed under scrutiny. What he wielded instead was pattern and proof. He traced not just the event, but the timing, the leverage, the way one headline supported another. His humor was his scalpel, sharp enough to draw blood without ever raising his voice. The catalyst came quietly. He watched, year after year, as one particular, Family Values brand was pushed like a blockbuster release. It wasn't just about a politician's private marriage, it was about how that marriage was deployed in politics. Fundraising dinners branded as anniversaries, photo ops with spouses tied to legislative rollouts, carefully placed interviews about personal virtue released days before controversial votes. Samuel saw the dissonance grow. Voters were being sold not just policy, but a carefully scripted love story. So he began his own quiet prep. He asked researchers to compile open-source timeline concordances. Event rosters matched with photo op calendars. Charity galas cross-referenced with policy releases. Moments of personal branding compared to spikes in campaign fundraising. The patterns were impossible to ignore. Whenever the marriage narrative was pushed, money followed. Whenever virtue was marketed, leverage shifted. He made a choice. If confronted on live television, he wouldn't spill names or humiliate a private citizen. But he would expose the mechanism. He would show the audience how easily their trust was manipulated when personal vows became political stagecraft. He would make the public see that what they thought was intimacy was actually branding. And in his mind, he rehearsed a single line, knowing the power of one well-placed phrase. "I'm not your gossip site, I'm your lie detector." For Donald Trump, image was oxygen. It wasn't an accessory to power, it was the very substance of it. In Mar-a-Lago, the Gilded Lounge had been converted into a makeshift war room. Screens mounted on the walls ran split feeds of cable news chyrons, trending hashtags and polling tickers. Every narrative shift was tracked like weather radar, every headline treated like a storm front. At the center of this command hub was Colby Dent, his press secretary. Colby's fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, drafting counterpunches before the first blow was even landed. His opening volley was already set. Hollywood smear, jealous elite. The wording was designed to trigger loyalty, to frame every critique as envy of Trump's dominance. Trump's surrogates had been prepped days in advance. Earl Maddox and Shelton Briggs, two of his most aggressive defenders, carried flashcards of talking points. Their lines were simple, repeatable. Family is off limits. This is an attack on faith. This is what happens when elites fear the people's choice. Each phrase was engineered to play well in 30-second corners of the media ecosystem. But behind the slogans was a quieter machinery, the legal whisperers. Trump's lawyers understood the power of intimidation. They reminded him that even if Jackson never named names, his words could be reframed as motive-driven slander. If he avoids specifics, one attorney advised, pivot to intent. Frame it as an attack on faith and marriage itself. Make it not about your family, but about everyone's family. The goal was to universalize the insult, to transform one man's critique into a wound carried by millions. Trump's reflex had always been the same: label any scrutiny of his brand as a strike on his family. This reflex turned criticism into martyrdom. By painting himself as the target of cruel elites, he invited his supporters to see themselves in his suffering. Outrage wasn't just defense, it was offense. He flooded the zone with fire until opponents were too burned to continue. In the corner of the war room, a boilerplate lawsuit press release sat on standby. The text had been templated long before Samuel Jackson's appearance. All it needed was a name, a date, and a dollar figure. It was a sword hanging on the wall, ready to fall at the moment Trump decided the story had gone too far. And as Samuel's words began to ripple through the networks, Trump's sphere tensed. To them, this wasn't an actor talking. This was a threat to the brand, to the carefully curated image that sustained the movement. The studio lights burned brighter than they should have, that familiar television glare now carrying the weight of expectation. Karen Delaney shuffled her cards again, pretending to review notes, but everyone knew she was buying time. She had just lobbed a question that sounded light on paper, something about Hollywood, actors, and politics, and now it had turned into an inferno. Her eyes narrowed as she leaned forward, voice steady but probing. "You've been blunt for years, Samuel. But tonight, you're hinting at something bigger. What changed?" Samuel L. Jackson didn't fidget, didn't break a smile, didn't play the character the public had grown used to. He lowered his voice, sharpening the cadence so that even the air conditioners seemed to go silent. When a marriage becomes a campaign prop, Voters deserve to know where the prop stops and the policy starts. The words didn't explode like fireworks. They sliced, deliberate, surgical. Karen flinched, but only slightly, like she had just realized the ground beneath her chair was shifting. "Are you alleging deception?" she asked, her tone a careful blend of curiosity and defense, the way seasoned anchors hold their composure while knowing the floor may collapse. Samuel didn't blink. "I'm saying the presentation of devotion has been used like armor, rolled out on cue, shielding agendas from questions. Not lies told about love, but love staged for leverage." A cough broke from row 3, unplanned but cinematic in its own right. Somewhere else, a pen slipped off a notepad and clattered onto the studio floor. The sound wasn't loud, but in a room where everyone held their breath, it was thunder. Karen pressed again, quieter this time. "So what you're telling America tonight is that we've been watching theater, not truth?" Samuel leaned back, and the smirk returned. Not the playful one, but the veteran's smirk that signals you've seen this game too long to be fooled. No private names, no invasions. Patterns only. Excess, timing, and doors that opened because the ring was on camera. The crew looked at each other. In the glass booth, a producer whispered into a headset. "He just redirected the night. We've lost the light chatter segment. Stay wide, do not cut." On stage, Karen shuffled her cue cards again, this time so visibly the audience noticed. She whispered something to her producer off mic, her lips caught faintly. He just redirected the night. The musical sting designed for commercial breaks hovered, then cut in under the next line. Karen pivoted into the camera. "We'll be right back." The jib camera floated upward for a slow, wide pullback. Samuel didn't move, didn't glance away, just waited. His silence was louder than the music. The screen faded black on a low, ominous note. The audience didn't clap. They didn't know if they were supposed to. When the show returned, the atmosphere had changed. The glossy studio floor reflected more than lights. It reflected dread, anticipation, and the nervous shuffling of a host who had lost her footing. Karen Delaney's smile was practiced, but her eyes betrayed the tension. She leaned forward, tone clipped. "So you're saying this concept of marriage as brand has shaped not just personal images but public moments?" Samuel chuckled. Not the kind of laugh that softens tension, but the kind that confirmed the absurdity of a system too long unchallenged. "Shaped rollouts," he corrected. "Big difference. Look at when, together, content peaks, then map the policy messaging that follows." He didn't name names, didn't need to. He listed specifics with the calmness of a man who had rehearsed the truth until it sounded like scripture. Photo op clusters always land before fundraising sprints. Weekend getaways overlap with donor summits. National holidays are turned into reset buttons after scandal weeks. You don't need to believe me, just look at the footage, the timestamps, the patterns. The audience stirred, the murmur rolling like a wave cresting but not yet breaking. Karen blinked fast, her producer waving frantically from the booth to stay on this line. She tightened her grip on the cards. "So you're accusing an entire political machine of selling devotion as a distraction?" Samuel tilted his head. "I'm not accusing. I'm observing. This is what happens when marriage is used as a shield. When a vow becomes a product, voters stop getting truth and start getting a script." And then it happened. The internet lit up like a grid of fireworks. Hashtags ignited across Twitter. Marriage as brand, props vs policy, receipts over romance. Clips of Samuel's earlier line already played on loop, TikTok splicing his words. "Okay, Nads." Inside Mar-a-Lago, phones began melting with calls. Trump's inner circle scrambled. Colby Dent barked at aides. "Get him on and live now! Flood the airwaves!" Meanwhile, in the studio, Karen tried to claw back control. "But Samuel, you're walking a dangerous line. This borders on questioning faith, questioning family." Samuel sat up straighter, voice firmer now. "Faith is sacred. Family is sacred. But don't you dare package them for votes. Don't you dare weaponize love as a distraction from power. The legal analyst sitting in studio corners began whispering notes into recorders. One murmured on air, "He's threading the line. He avoids identities, but the tactic is verifiable. This isn't gossip, it's pattern recognition." By the time the segment hit the 10-minute mark, Samuel's words had escaped the studio. They were trending globally. And yet, everyone in the room knew what came next. Trump wouldn't stay silent. The control booth crackled with static and urgency. A new message lit up Karen's teleprompter. "Trump live down Lin. Confirm." She froze for half a second, then looked back to camera 2. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an unexpected call joining us. Former President Donald Trump is on the line." The split screen opened. Trump's face filled the right side, red and tense, his voice already raised before introductions finished. "Tubal Hollywood lies. A sick man trashes families on primetime television. This is slander, pure slander. I'll sue." The audience gasped. Some laughed nervously. Others looked around as though history was happening in front of them. Which it was. On the left side of the screen, Samuel didn't move. His expression was granite. When Trump finally paused to breathe, Samuel leaned into his mic, speaking low. "This isn't about love. It's about marketing. Love deserves privacy. Campaign props do not." Trump erupted again, his voice now shrill with indignation. "Keep wives out of politics. Family is sacred. These are attacks on faith." But the production team was quick. They cued B-roll older clips of Trump himself leveraging marriage optics, flaunting his image as a devoted husband during rallies, introducing his spouse at fundraisers. The contrast was undeniable. Karen looked trapped between chaos and clarity. "Gentlemen, let's keep this civil," she tried, but her voice was swallowed by the clash. Trump's surrogates had already been lined up for rebuttals, their faces flashing across networks. "This is Hollywood elitism. Keep personal life off the table." But social media wasn't buying it. Samuel's phrase, "When vows become props, the voter gets stabbed in the back," was now printed across memes, stitched into sound bites, re-ensourced in furious solidarity. Samuel leaned back, offering his closer for the night, not raising his voice but dropping it just enough that silence fell to catch it. "Privacy deserves respect. Public trust deserves protection. When a vow is used as a shield, the voter gets stabbed in the back. That's the line I won't let anyone cross." The room went still. Karen glanced sideways, whispering into her hot mic, "We've never aired anything like this." Even as producers yelled, even as Trump shouted over the feed, even as networks scrambled to spin, the story had shifted. Samuel hadn't named a single spouse, hadn't touched a single private detail. He had done something far sharper, exposed the machine behind the mask. Already, whispers in congressional hallways were forming. Committees debated whether campaign disclosures should include personal branding expenditures. Networks replayed the clip on loop. The confrontation wasn't over. It had just drawn its first blood. Every news cycle has a hinge, a click where the country's attention locks into place, and Samuel L. Jackson supplied it in a single breath. Within an hour of the broadcast, networks spliced his line, "When a marriage becomes a campaign prop, voters deserve to know where the prop stops and the policy starts," into packages opening every hour on the hour. Karen Delaney's stunned inhale after the sentence became the universal reaction shot. Producers kept replaying the two-beat silence that followed, as if America itself had placed a palm flat on the table and said, "Don't move." Morning shows leaned in. An anchor in Manhattan replayed the clip, then asked plainly, "Is this courage or cruelty?" The frame paused on Samuel's face, unhurried, unsmiling, and the director cut to a panel of consultants who suddenly sounded like civics teachers. The conversation refused to treat it as gossip. It treated it as governance. One strategist, palms up, sighed. "If family is part of the message discipline, then it's part of the campaign apparatus. That's not a rumor. That's logistics." Late-night comics followed the same curve. The monologue started with the easy laugh. 911. What's your emergency? An unvetted photo-op with premium lighting. But halfway through, the host sighed. 9 explainers bloom. TikTok timelines filled with crisp infographics mapping access vectors. Guest list, donor suite, messaging pivot, family constant blast. Commenters didn't ask for names. They asked for proof paths. Teen creators stitched Samuel's sentence to diagrams of badge logs and unscheduled entrances pulled from publicly posted photos. High school teachers grabbed the trend for in-class assignments, draw a trust chain, label points where a private image becomes a public instrument, and argue which disclosures protect both dignity and democracy. Opinion pages split down the center. One camp scolded Samuel for character assassination, by implication. Another praised him for refusing to name a private individual while naming the mechanism itself. That last point stuck. Even critics conceded the precision. He targeted a tactic. In editorial meetings across the country, that phrasing, mechanism, not person, appeared on one. Ratings spiked. Producers stacked A/B reels. Trump's blistering phone. By nightfall of day 2, newsrooms shifted from pure reaction to resourcing. Investigative desks requested visitor logs from past private weekends, compiled open-source timelines of photo ops and policy rollouts, and assigned reporters to parse filing minutiae around family brand content used in fundraising emails. "This isn't about bedrooms," one editor told her team, tapping a spreadsheet. "This is about paperwork." The meeting ended with a note in bold: maintain dignity, verify pathways, center the public interest. It had detonated, but its blast radius wasn't measured in salacious details. It was measured in standards suddenly articulated aloud. Television found a frame big enough for both love and scrutiny, and once that frame appeared, the lens refused to shrink again. By the weekend, even apolitical shows adopted the language. Cooking segments joked about ingredient disclosures, then nodded at the camera. Transparency tastes better. Sports radio callers compared cap space rules to disclosure rules. If a relationship becomes a roster move, the league wants paperwork. The metaphor landed everywhere. It wasn't moral panic, it was maintenance oil for the engine of trust daily. Barbershops felt it first, because barbershops always do. The Saturday hum of clippers cut around debates that sounded like porch arguments from another century. "If it's love, leave it alone," an older man insisted, cape around his shoulders. "If it's leverage, say it," a younger dad answered, eyes flicking to his phone as a clip of Samuel's line looped for the 100th time. The country had heard the question and carried it into everyday rooms. In PTA basements, folding chairs squeaked as parents passed around bake sale flyers and talking points. "Show us the disclosures for family content tied to fundraising," one mother said, tapping a handwritten note. "If the campaign schedules a together photo shoot 2 days before a donor drive, that's a tactic, not tender." The room murmured. A father with paint on his hands added, "If it's a brand, it's a business tool." Someone wrote the sentence on the whiteboard. Factory floors carried the conversation across shift changes. A welder in Toledo pointed to the safety log and said, "We file for everything we touch. If love becomes leverage, file for that too." His crew laughed, then fell quiet as the radio replayed Trump's live outburst back-to-back with Samuel's calm. "Volume versus verification?" the host quipped, and no one disagreed. Flash polls trickled out by mid-morning. Independents leaned toward necessary sunlight. The base hardened around family is sacred, while decorum-focused moderates wobbled, torn between don't pry and don't mislead. Those numbers moved not with scandals but with standards. The cross-tabs showed it clearly. The more respondents believed that family content had been used in fundraising or message resets, the more they favored disclosure rules. The debate was shedding heat and gaining shape. Inboxes swelled. Veterans wrote first. "We fought to stop leverage from abroad. Don't import it at home," one letter read, signed by a VFW hall in Kansas. Teachers followed with blunt grace. "Standards, not rumors," a union chapter posted, attaching a sample accountability checklist any civics class could adapt. Distinguish private grief, private joy, and public performance. Require receipts only when performance drives policy or money. Quiet grief entered the bloodstream through military spouses who understood optics as both comfort and cover. "If families becomes a shield for access, that puts families like mine at risk," a woman in Norfolk wrote. Keep my kids out of your stagecraft unless the stagecraft is honest. Her post gathered thousands of gentle hearts and a thread of practical questions. Who vets visitor lists for donor weekends, marketed as private time? Who decides when a photo becomes propaganda? Who keeps the gate when the gate is a camera? College dorms held their own tribunals. Students argued like they were cramming for finals, phones open to timelines, notebooks open to ethics. A freshman from Savannah said, I don't care about salacious stuff. I care about consent. Did the public consent to being marketed to with someone's marriage? A senior countered, didn't need information so we can consent. Their RA wrote, consent requires information on a torn piece of poster board and taped it to the lounge wall. Across town, Caroline Leavitt watched in silence from her apartment couch, blue light reflected in her eyes. She remembered the feeling of being speechless on camera, the way a sentence could freeze a room and refocus a nation. She didn't tweet, she didn't book cable, she just listened as a debate about privacy evolved into a conversation about integrity. Somewhere past midnight, she closed the laptop and whispered to no one, clarity wins. On Capitol Hill, theater announced itself in the old way, a podium dragged to a hallway, a wad of microphones and 2 congressmen who practiced their outrage in the elevator. Representatives Earl Maddox and Shelton Briggs unfurled a censure resolution that called Samuel's remarks reckless insinuations against private citizens. Countdown clocks sprouted on cable banners. Vote in 48-0. The point wasn't passage, the point was posture. Staffers circulated one-pagers. Family is sacred. Hands off. But leaks began to nibble at the script. An internal memo, whispered to reporters at 2 national outlets, claimed there was a split at the top. The First Lady's circle preferred silence, elevate above the mess, while the boss demanded a counterattack, preferably loud. Headlines braided the tension into a marquee. Divide at the top. None did, but the rumor's shape matched the week's footage. Trump's voice at full volume. Outside the Beltway, protest signs condensed the argument into sidewalk syllables. Privacy ends at leverage. Public office, public standards. Love license. In Albuquerque, a grandmother marched with her granddaughter, explaining that loving families shouldn't become lobbying passes. In Miami, a Cuban-American veterans group held a rally under a freeway folding flags with the care they gave words. We're not asking to see their house, one man said into a handheld amp. We're asking to see the receipts when their house becomes the billboard. Committees kept their distance from the cameras and moved quietly. Council drafted letters requesting visitor logs for donor weekends marketed as private time, manifest verifications for charter flights attached to family events, and audits of event badges granted without standard vetting. A subcommittee staffer wrote a memo titled Guidance on Family Brand Content in Fundraising Communications and attached 3 models from nonpartisan groups. The tone was dull by design, bureaucracy doing its job. For once, dull felt like daylight. The blowback machine spun, but it coughed. A longtime surrogate, polished, loyal, always on time, sat for a cable hit and faltered. I defended what I never examined, she admitted, hands open. Voters deserve clarity. The clip looped across platforms, not as betrayal but as relief. Comment sections filled with quiet gratitude. Thanks for saying the simple thing aloud. That sentence did more damage to the week's talking points than any monologue could. It made curiosity respectable. In the courts of probability, lawsuits fluttered like phantom birds. A boilerplate threat letter leaked, full of words like injurious and compensation and retraction, but even legal analysts on friendly networks shook their heads. If he didn't name anyone, what's the claim? One asked. Motives aren't defamatory. False facts are. The phrase went up on chyrons. Motive demonition. The distinction spread like a memo to the national brain. Back in newsrooms, standards editors redlined their own habits. No more coy euphemisms, no more wink and nudge. Phillips' segment referenced family, content. A lower third would now say whether it was linked to a fundraising drive or policy rollout. The update looked small on the screen, a 7-word footnote, but it changed the temperature. Viewers were finally given the label that told them which part of the show they were watching. By the 4th night, the censure stunt arrived on the House schedule, then promptly collapsed beneath procedural weight. Even members who disliked Samuel's tone disliked the precedent more. The podium rolled away. The clocks stopped. In its place, a different timer started. Slow, bureaucratic, relentless. As committees piled up requests, audit plans, and rule drafts, the spectacle dimmed. The paperwork brightened. And in that reversal, the comeback completed its pivot from viral moment to institutional momentum. Less roar, more record. On college campuses across the country, students did not wait for congressional hearings to begin asking their own questions. They organized what they called sit-ins of questions, gathering in libraries, lecture halls, and even outside television studios with hand-lettered posters that read, "When does private become policy?" For a generation raised on viral clips and endless campaign ads featuring smiling families, Jackson's words felt like someone ripping the protective wrapping off a product they had been told to consume without thinking. Professors found themselves rewriting syllabi overnight, incorporating discussions about political branding, the blurred lines between intimacy and influence, and whether voters had the right to transparency when personal lives were staged as political marketing tools. Veterans halls told a different but equally powerful story. Old soldiers and younger veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan sat around coffee-stained tables repeating the same phrase. Leverage is a battlefield word. It doesn't belong near the resolute desk. For them, leverage meant using people or situations to gain advantage in combat zones. Hearing it now in connection to marriage branding struck a nerve. The sentiment spread beyond those rooms, becoming a talking point on radio shows and in community papers, amplifying the idea that politics could not be allowed to reduce personal vows into tactical shields. Teachers also responded with urgency. Across the Midwest and the South, educators compiled what they called accountability toolkits. These weren't abstract lectures, but practical lesson plans, inviting students to map how campaign events used imagery of spouses or children in the days preceding major announcements. The exercises forced students to connect optics with policy drops, treating political communication not as passive entertainment, but as civic material worthy of inspection. By the end of the week, TikTok was filled with teenagers explaining accountability checklists, turning the once dry subject of campaign ethics into viral civic education. Immigrant families carried their own layer of response. For years, they had lived under scrutiny, checking documents, proving legitimacy, facing sudden inspections. On Spanish-language radio and in community centers, a refrain took hold. "We've had our papers checked for years. Why are the powerful exempt?" What began as private murmurs became a thread repeated across platforms, comparing the burden placed on ordinary families with the exemptions enjoyed by elites. Mothers who carried copies of birth certificates in their purses for fear of ICE agents began to ask, if their family photos were subject to suspicion, why shouldn't campaign families prove that their staged images were not deceptive either? From this collision of classrooms, veterans' halls, and immigrant kitchens, a new refrain was born. We carry papers like armor. Who else should? It wasn't a smear. It wasn't personal gossip. It was a civics chant. The power of the phrase was its simplicity. By the month's end, it appeared on signs, bumper stickers, and protest banners, crystallizing the cultural fallout Samuel had ignited. What started as a televised remark had grown into a chant that questioned the very boundaries of American political branding. If cultural fallout set the stage, political consequences soon followed. Reform and transparency organizations experienced an unexpected windfall. Small-dollar donations surged as everyday Americans, energized by the prop versus policy debate, funneled their frustration into groups promising new rules for campaign disclosures. These donations were not simply about opposing Trump. They carried a broader appeal. Independent voters who normally avoided partisan fights found themselves drawn to the language of fairness and equal standards. By contrast, counterfunder freezing framed around "protect the family" rallied the Republican base, but struggled to break out beyond loyal supporters, revealing an engagement gap. Behind the scenes, law enforcement took the fallout seriously. Disinformation campaigns and coordinated harassment networks spiked within days of Samuel's remarks. Capitol Police widened security details around his next appearances, while major platforms scrambled to suppress brigading networks trying to spin his words into fabricated scandals. What had started as a cultural flashpoint was now categorized as part of the threat matrix, an ongoing concern for both security professionals and digital trust teams who recognize the volatility of mixing personal identity with political branding. On Capitol Hill, oversight momentum began to build. Bipartisan staffers, cautious but attentive, started sketching hearing topics. These ranged from visitor logs at donor weekends to boundaries between family events and political fundraisers, even extending to possible disclosure guidelines for family brand content. The idea was simple but groundbreaking. If a marriage or family portrait was used as part of a campaign rollout, it should be disclosed as intentionally as any financial contribution. The concept was controversial, yet the fact it was discussed at all showed how dramatically Samuel's confrontation had shifted the terrain. Coalition politics also evolved. Hashtags like it wasn't rooted in traditional divides, but in a shared sense of fairness. Whether progressive or conservative, people agreed that voters deserved clarity when private life became a public shield. The final ripple was operational. Political action committees, sensing the risk, quietly returned questionable donations tied to high-profile family events. Event planners inserted clauses banning unvetted proximity between donors and campaign spouses. Campaign compliance officers began drafting what they bluntly called relationship as. The fallout from one live exchange was no longer theoretical. It had altered how campaigns raised money, planned events, and framed their most intimate images. By the end of the cycle, even skeptical operatives admitted the obvious. Samuel's words had forced politics to confront a blind spot. What once was sacred and untouchable was now subject to public accountability, reshaping the balance between private devotion and public trust. The cameras eventually cut away, but the silence Samuel Jackson had broken could not be repaired. It lingered in classrooms, in households, in union halls, and in the cautious offices of political operatives. For the first time in years, the narrative wasn't controlled by carefully crafted campaign videos or glossy magazine profiles. It was driven by a single moment of truth, spoken with calm precision, in front of millions of people. That truth raised a question larger than one family, larger than one president, larger than one political cycle. Who owns the story of America? Samuel had drawn a line in the sand. Not against love, not against marriage, not against the intimacy people deserve in their private lives. His line was against weaponization, against turning sacred vows into shields, against staging affection as leverage, against treating intimacy as a prop to advance power. That distinction mattered, because in a democracy, the boundary between private devotion and public accountability cannot be blurred without consequence. When it does blur, the very foundation of trust begins to crumble. The cultural echoes proved the point. Students chanting outside lecture halls weren't demanding gossip. They were demanding fairness. Veterans, hardened by combat, weren't gossiping about a politician's home. They were defending the language of duty from being cheapened by spin. Immigrant families weren't asking to invade privacy. They were asking why scrutiny applies to them and not to the powerful. This was the through line. Accountability belongs everywhere. Power is leveraged, especially when it hides behind the veil of family. And that's where you, the viewer, enter this story. Because accountability doesn't begin in a marble hall or with a celebrity's microphone. It begins in the choices ordinary people make every day. It begins when we refuse to let political branding substitute for policy. It begins when we ask candidates, with the same urgency students asked in their sit-ins, when does private become policy? If this moment proved anything, it is that truth can cut through choreography. One person, in one broadcast, shattered a carefully constructed stage. That should give us hope. It means the narrative isn't locked. It means the story can still be written by people who demand transparency, who refuse to accept props in place of policy, who carry accountability as the true armor of democracy. So here is the call. Do not let this conversation fade when the hashtags change. Push it in your classrooms, your workplaces, your communities. Ask the hard questions, not because they're easy, but because they're necessary. Demand that the leaders who market virtue live by the same standards they sell. If you believe that accountability must apply to everyone, from the most powerful office to the smallest town hall, share this story. Subscribe to our channel so these truths don't disappear into silence. Add your voice, your question, your demand, because silence is exactly what power counts on. And tonight, as Samuel reminded America, silence can always be broken.